This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Oh my Lord, what shall I do?
I'm Gavin Jones, and I'll be moderating our third panel, Faith and Folklore, and I'd like very briefly to introduce our four panelists. First off, we have Marcellus Blount, who is an associate professor of English at Columbia University. He is also currently the Sterling A. Brown visiting professor of English at Williams College. He'll be talking about Slavery Remembered, Dunbar, and the African American Elegy. We have Michael Cohen. Michael is a PhD candidate at New York University. His paper is called Dunbar and the Genres of Dialect. We have Yolanda Pierce, who is an associate professor of English and African American Studies at the University of Kentucky. She'll be talking about that old-time religion, an Afro-Christian faith tradition in Dunbar's short stories. And finally, Lauri Ramey, who is an associate professor of creative writing and African American literature and culture at the California State University, Los Angeles. Her paper is titled The Old Homestead, Home in the Spirituals and Dunbar. Thank you.
I think I remembered to bring the right paper. Yeah, Slavery Remembered, Paul Laurence Dunbar and the African American Elegy. A hush is over all the teeming lists, and there is pause, a breath space in the strife. A spirit brave has passed beyond the mists and vapors that obscure the sun of life, and Ethiopia, with bosom torn, laments the passing of her noblest born. This stanza began Paul Laurence Dunbar's long elegy for Frederick Douglass. Here, Dunbar's speaker solemnly utters sentiments that suggest Douglass's importance within the context of an American narrative of race, and as well prophesies a kind of racial deliverance toward which Douglass's political activities had moved that black race, indeed the black nation. Language, trope, and affect are sifted through a mother's loss, a loss felt by the black race, a loss felt perhaps by all of Dunbar's readers. This tension between the individual and the collective loss becomes important to how we read this early African American elegy, as Dunbar mines multiple literary and cultural traditions to find the language that befits his purpose of marking the passage of such a great black leader. When he imagines Douglass's passing as the trope of the death of the race's noblest born, his chosen themes are both matrilineal and intra-generational. By figuring Ethiopia as Douglass's mother, an argument about racial identity ensues. The black race is that maternal essence that Douglass's presence had embodied. His absence, nonetheless, speaks to the urgency of racial identity for blacks in the 1890s. The Ethiopianism of this passage, to borrow a phrase from Wilson Moses, speaks to an emerging sense of blacks as belonging to a black nation whose experiences are foretold in biblical prophecy. Blacks will triumph as predicted. Yet, 1895, the year of Douglass's death, marks a dark moment in the race's history. The work of the poem is to convince Dunbar's readers that the generations from which Douglass's leadership issues will continue even without him, No, Dunbar insists, because of him. But still thy voice is ringing o'er the gale. And that voice will continue to ring in the collective voice of the elegy. It is no accident of history that 1895 marks the death of this one racial leader, even as it marks the ascendancy of another, Booker T. Washington. Although we currently inherit Washington variously, particularly given the poignancy of Du Bois's critique of him in The Souls of Black Folk, it is nonetheless the case that Dunbar wants to present an argument about racial leadership, and he avoids the difficulties of the differing politics of Douglass, Washington, and Du Bois, for that matter. Even as he penned this poem, Frederick Douglass, to mark the passing of the greatest of Black leaders, his spacious elegies make room for a figure like Washington himself. If the overall thrust of the Douglass poem is to move forward, Booker T. Washington captures Dunbar looking backward. Given the place of autobiography in the emergence of African-American literary history, and given that both Douglass and his works of 1845, 1855, and 1892, and Washington and his Up From Slavery, 1901, privilege autobiography as a basic Black epistemology, it is not surprising that Dunbar's Washington poem rehearses the details of Booker T's life. Both Douglass and Washington had been slaves, while Dunbar's Frederick Douglass chooses to emphasize a more generalized racial past. The poem Booker T. Washington turns upon the specificity of Washington's escape from slavery. Writing at the turn of the century, given the various structures of political, social, and economic oppression Blacks were forced to endure, it seems especially apt to elegize Washington by rewriting his escape from slavery. Slavery for Dunbar is an overdetermined signifier. It points to a specific historical institution, but more generally it functions as a metaphor for historical oppression. For Washington, to escape slavery means that Blacks might escape their current oppression. Booker T. Washington begins with these lines: "The word is writ that he who runs may read." What this particular elegy presents is an ongoing strategy of Douglass's elegiac project. This strategy is the quest for freedom and literacy, or to be more precise, the quest for freedom through literacy. For Dunbar, literacy means a number of different things. Of course, that entails literally being able to read and write, but it also entails a kind of cultural and historical literacy. In his poetry, Dunbar is constructing a pantheon of heroes, and by so doing, presenting their lives as texts to be read. They come to function as exemplars of racial identity in the face of racist ideology. To risk sounding cliché, Dunbar wants us to read his poems both literally and figuratively, and his poems encode the terms through which our figurative imaginations might be stabilized. The form of the elegy itself operates as a strategy of reading. With race as the basic grammar of identity, Dunbar encourages us to see his poem as being replete with racial signifiers. The history of American slavery is displaced onto a template of African origins, while this displacement is more explicit in Dunbar's Frederick Douglass. It operates more subtly in Dunbar's Booker T. Washington. Dunbar teaches us how to read the poem, the particular historical economy of language. If we move to the Sestet of the Washington poem, the final simile is telling. Straight on he goes, nor turns to look behind, where hot the hounds come baying at his hip, with one idea foremost in his mind, like the keen prow of some on-forging ship. Washington, the runaway slave, is likened to a ship. That final rhyme completes the image potential of the ninth line of the poem, where we get the verbal slippage of brow and lip. The history of American slavery, therefore, is displaced onto the experience of the middle passage, which the poet Robert Hayden would later characterize as a voyage through death to life upon these shores. In this elegy, the individual life comes to stand for the American experience, which in turn represents a sense of an African past. The importance of this strategy is unmistakable. The journey which Douglass and Washington undertake involves a movement toward a specific racialized inheritance. Their quest for freedom is not something new, but in some ways a return to African origins and sustenance. Thus, Dunbar teaches us to read these individual poems as racial allegories. In this paper, I use a set of terms to point out how I see Dunbar as initiating a tradition of African-American elegy. I should underscore here that I am not arguing that the African-American practice is necessarily distinctive from other forms of the elegy, but what I'd like to suggest is such practice is ongoing. Dunbar's poems of the 1890s point us directly to more recent elegies written by African Americans in the latter part of the 20th century. Also, what I want to suggest is that Dunbar's elegies anticipate the work of later poets such as Robert Hayden and Michael S. Harper. What I'm pointing to are characteristic poetic practices that are signs of a developing literary tradition. And part of that is to understand the ways in which we read the elegy, Dunbar's elegies, through these shapes of racial allegory. In maintaining that Dunbar's elegies function as racial allegories, I want to argue that Dunbar and other African-American poets are particularly invested in how individual utterance might illustrate communal values and how the individual comes to stand for the community. That community might be configured variously, but it is a conspicuous feature of these elegies that they turn on asserting the poet's relations to living communities, that these meditations upon the dead enact an emotional and ideological relationship to the living. In the Frederick Douglass poem I have presented thus far, the act of elegiac mourning reaffirms the connections among African Americans at the time Dunbar was writing. The poem functions as a kind of metonym for the hyphenated African American, a term we now use, that is, for the unstable identities of blacks in the post-Reconstruction era. The sense of looking backward to an empowering sense of an African past becomes a way to militate against the racism implicit in their tentative American identities. This sense of community stabilizes Dunbar's treatment of Washington, who as a figure, while still alive, might be lost to the controversy over his ideologies of race and social uplift. Dunbar writes to mend the breach of community that ensued over the controversy of Washington's life. In African American elegies, race often stands for community, and that sense of community is often structured through a figurative glimpse of the past. In particular, and black writers of the 19th century, working through a range of genres, refer to Ethiopia in ways that suggest the entire African continent. Within the politics of locating race within a geographical terrain, Ethiopia functions as a site of identity in a range of temporalities. The politics of a return to Africa, mapped out in the non-fictional prose of such figures as Martin Delany and Alexander Crummell, suggests for Dunbar a symbolic landscape through which his poems journey toward black self-identification. In this particular elegy, the reference to Ethiopia in the first stanza and then subsequent allusions point to Africa as a gendered space, one which suggests both African origins and a kind of nascent Pan-Africanism that, say, would be more fully realized in the 20th century politics of a figure such as Marcus Garvey. Ethiopia in the poem is gendered as the mother, intimating the language of Africa as the motherland and calling attention to the structure of the family as a network of identity. And this is so important for Dunbar in his poems, the ways in which he might imagine the figure of the family as standing for a figure of his audience, that he might be, through this trope of familiar relations, be creating something akin to what Dr. Martin Luther King characterized as the beloved community. It is important as well that as we decode the ideological strategies of Dunbar's racial allegories, that we do not fail to attend to questions of nation. These work in seemingly contradictory ways. The poem Frederick Douglass calls upon its readers to imagine a black Pan-African nation, yet at the same time, Dunbar's fluency and seemingly white literary conventions calls upon his calm access to literary authority that transcends race. Dunbar writes as an American elegist, reaching back not just to Whitman, but to the inheritance of the American Puritan elegy, which they share, even as he locates himself within the borders of English poetic tradition, as he revels in the kind of belated romanticism that would characterize African-American poetry well into the 20th century. Nationalism of various sorts are at work in Dunbar's elegies, but the equations are fairly stable. Race equal family, equal community, equal nation. That is, as long as Dunbar himself can define that model of social and literary relations. The elegy would be one vehicle through which Dunbar could articulate his complex inheritance as a poet, even as his poems remember slavery. They prophesy continued deliverance. But perhaps the question remains, for whom? Are we still a part of Dunbar's nation?
My name is Mike Cohen, and this paper is called Dunbar and the Genres of Dialect. And it comes out of a larger project that I'm working on the life of poems in 19th century American public culture. In particular, I look at how so-called popular poetic genres, such as ballads and spirituals, were linked by their imagined connection to the folk, a discursive concept with wide-ranging effects on society, culture, and politics in the 19th century US. So if it seems like you're getting a lot of ballads before you get any Dunbar, I apologize in advance. When asked in a 1902 interview whether he preferred to write quote-unquote Negro songs or other types of poems, Dunbar responded that, quote, "It depends entirely on my mood. Sometimes I am fascinated by the Negro song. It carries me along, writes or sings itself," unquote. Quote-unquote Negro ballads, as the interviewer went on to call them, exerted a peculiar hold on the body and might therefore have, quote, something of the same relation to American poetry that Scottish songs do to English poetry. While the interview shifted silently from Negro song to Negro ballad, I want to seize this comparison and think about how the turn to Scottish ballads might help to address some of the questions that have attended critical readings of Dunbar's work. Do poems written in black dialect provide access to a black experience that cannot be reached through poems written in standard English? Do these dialect poems use linguistic difference to reinforce racist hierarchies, or does the use of dialect ironize and subvert such hierarchies? I will not directly address these questions in this paper. Instead, I want to think about the conventions of thought necessary in order to ask such questions in the first place. Since the 1920s, critics have most often considered the problems of dialect to be problems of linguistic form, but I want to consider them here as problems of genre that are specific to the literary form of the dialect poem. The turn to Scottish ballads is therefore instructive, since it connects the dialect poem to a larger discourse on popular poetic genres. Participants in the discourses on popular poetry substituted abstractions of genre for persons and personal voices, so that poems came to stand for particular types of social experience. Therefore, when participants in the discourse on dialect poetry drew upon these other discourses, they did so to authenticate dialect poems as the expressions of racialized folk groups. The discursive connections between Scottish ballads and Black American songs have a long history in American thought. An 1855 essay entitled Negro Minstrelsy, Ancient and Modern stated that authentic songs of the quote-unquote golden age of Negro literature, quote, were as impossible to counterfeit or successfully imitate as it would be for a modern poet to produce a border ballad like Chevy Chase or Lord Jamie Douglas. The shameless imitations carry their imposture on their face. The allusion to ancient English and Scottish ballads cannot fail to bring to the mind of the poetical scholar the striking similarity that exists between many of the specimens of Percy, Ritson, and others, and the most approved poetry of the African school. Let the words peculiarly Scottish in any ancient ballad be literally translated into the African dialect, and we have at once a plantation song. This essay parodies what were, by the 1850s, hackneyed tropes about ballad scholarship that dated back at least 90 years. The essay's parodic innovation was to present quote-unquote true plantation songs, by which the author meant Jump Jim Crow, as self-authenticating structures like Scottish ballads. The true plantation song could therefore be differentiated from spurious modern imitations on the basis of its dialect, which became the final authenticating proof for each of these forms as a popular form. Because a dialect belonged to a particular people in their popular forms, it could provide real assurance that the song in question belonged to that people and came from them. But because dialects could also be translated from one form to another, they could be taken out of the specific context of their oral articulation and put into the domain of print circulation. The value of dialect came in its ability both to authenticate folk poetry and to put that poetry into print circulation. This made dialect central to 19th century discourses on genres like ballads and spirituals, because these discourses imagined objects that were the spontaneous products of unitary social groups that existed in a time and space prior to and outside of literate print modernity. In an 1874 essay on ballad poetry, F.J. Child, the foremost 19th century ballad theorist, defined the popular ballad as, quote, an expression of the mind and heart of the people as an individual. It is popular not in the sense of something arising from and suited to the lower orders of a people. As yet, no sharp distinction of high and low exists in respect to knowledge, desires, and tastes. An increased civilization, and especially the introduction of book culture, gradually gives rise to such a division. The poetry of art appears, the popular poetry is abandoned. But being founded on what is permanent and universal in the heart of man, and now by printing put beyond the danger of perishing, popular poetry will survive the fluctuations of taste, unquote. According to Child's definition, the popular poem could never coexist with literate print culture. Instead, literate culture saved popular poems from perishing by locking down the oral form and the stability of print. This transfer into print made the popular poem potent in modernity, even though it could no longer appear there naturally. Popular poems were valuable because they embodied the idiosyncrasies and particularities of a unified communal identity, and this indexical function of the popular poem was lodged in its oral form. When enshrined within the printed pages of the scholarly anthology, popular poems could serve as the wellsprings of modern literate expression, but only if they were authenticated by appropriately rigorous critical scholarship. One of Child's major innovations to ballad discourse was his development of a critical methodology that placed heavy value on the rough and archaic features of a popular poem, and one of these key features was dialect language. By the 1870s and 1880s, the discourse on popular poetic genres had adopted dialect as one of its central authenticating principles. Dialect facilitated the transition of oral poems into print circulation that was central to the historicism of ballad discourse. Dialect marked oral authenticity, but only when it circulated in print transcriptions. Dialect thus took on a fetish status in which its self-authenticating power increased the more it was strained by detachment from its original scene of transmission. The folk aura of a ballad like Chevy Chase grows as this poem becomes less and less like the culture around it. The ability to transmit such popular objects so far from their original milieu is the virtue of print, which, according to Child and others, is also the agent that destroyed the popular poem's original milieu. The fetishism of dialect came from its ability to produce strangeness while also ensuring print circulation, a fact noted by some of the earliest transcribers of spirituals. In Thomas Wentworth Higginson's 1867 essay, Negro Spirituals, he wrote that the spiritual was, quote, a kindred world of unwritten songs, as simple and indigenous as the border minstrelsy, unquote. But its inscription into print was infinitely more difficult because of the difficulty of the language spoken by the freed slaves of the Sea Islands. As described by William Francis Allen in the preface to his 1867 collection, Slave Songs of the United States, the language of the freed slaves of Port Royal had, quote unquote, an utterly un-English sound that could only be imperfectly denoted in print. If dialect became readable as the index for racialized speech, its readability was the product of its strangeness in print. This strangeness actually signified the popular poem's facility to move in print culture as the marker of oral authenticity. The more effectively the poem circulated, the stranger it would seem, because the further from its original scene of transmission it would go. Thus, authentic poems could be read as authentic because of the defamiliarizing power of dialect, which mediated the original circulatory mode of the poem and its modern instantiation as a print genre. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this new determination of dialect as the authorizing agent of the printed popular poem enabled the authored literary poem to become a dominant mode of articulating so-called folk experience. This is where Dunbar comes in. In his introduction to the 1896 Lyrics of Lowly Life, William Dean Howells wrote that, quote, the precious difference of temperament between the races is best preserved and most charmingly suggested by Mr. Dunbar in those pieces of his where he studies the moods and traits of his race in its own accent of our English. We call such pieces dialect pieces for want of some closer phrase, but they are really not dialect so much as delightful personal attempts and failures for the written and spoken language. For Howells, dialect could best preserve the accents that connote the precious differences of temperament between the races, because the circulation of dialect as a print genre enabled the written poem to disseminate folk cultures in a new, highly aestheticized literary form. The dialect poems were, according to Howells, divinations and reports of what passes in the hearts and minds of a lowly people whose poetry had hitherto been inarticulately expressed in music, but now finds for the first time in our tongue literary interpretation of a very artistic completeness. By the decadent 1890s, the long discursive history of popular poetry crafted the aesthetic dialect poem as a literary form that could project folk authenticity in a manner superior to ostensibly more archaic folk forms like the spiritual. Reinserting the discourse on dialect back into the discourses on popular poetic genres can help to explain how and why 19th century readers granted dialect poems so much cultural power. As a genre, dialect mediated the discursively constructed oppositions between genres of ancient folk oral circulation and modern literate print circulation. The mediations between and among these genres is, in fact, one of the principal features of Dunbar's poetry, which cuts across the critical divide between his dialect and his standard language poems. In the early poem's songs, Dunbar declared that I love the dear old ballads best because they were those songs the heart can feel that make our pulses throb. Such songs work their effects by internalizing themselves within the body of the reader-auditor, the way Dunbar imagined the Negro song in the interview quoted at the beginning of the paper. God sings through songs that touch the heart, and none are prized save these. Though men may ply their gilded art for fortune, fame, or fees, the muse that sets the songster's soul ablaze with lyric fire holds nature up, an open scroll, and builds art's funeral pyre. The natural power of the popular song undermines the force of the gilded art of literate poetry, even as it gives rise to that art by instantiating the ultimate poetic themes for Dunbar of love and death. As one of Dunbar's standard English poems, however, the poem cannot be what it claims to admire. It thus fixes itself outside the circle of true poetry, even as it ruminates on the ways in which that true poetry produces instances of the gilded art like itself. Similarly, a corn song dramatizes the discursive conflation of oral songs and literate modern culture. While the pastoralism of the poem seems to herald a desire for the world of the plantation, the poem figures nostalgia not in the bygone paternalism of slavery, but rather in the passing of oral song into literate poem. The master on the veranda overhears the song of the field hands returning from work. These field hands are described but never seen, and the master's relation to them comes only through the song, just as the reader's relation to the field hands exists only by virtue of the repeated insertion of their dialect song in the standard language narrative frame of the poem. This song drowns the master's dreamy thoughts as it rises through the silence, dusk, and dim of the evening landscape. It thus blends with the scene of its transmission, even while it is set off in the poem by its dialect, which disarticulates it from the literate language of the narratorial frame. At the end of the poem, the corn song brings a tear to the eye of the master as it faints away and falls into silence deep within the cabin, dying. The death of the song evokes all the strongest feelings of nostalgic desire for the plantation world, yet such a death is necessary for the song's inscription into the literate print poem. The modes of oral circulation and transmission figured both in the poem's action and in its strategy of dialect use require the silencing of the song. In order to become a fetishized indexical object, the orally circulated song must be reformatted for print dissemination within the literate poem. The Deserted Plantation intensifies the engagement between oral songs and printed poems by narrating the absence of the particular folk culture that the poem's dialect is imagined to make present. The spirituals, hymns, and work songs of this folk culture are evacuated and replaced by the natural sounds of bird songs and wind, whose presence evokes the absence of the human voice. Thus, the whippoorwill assumes the song of the mourner, the banjo's voice is silent in the quarters, and neither hymns nor corn songs ring in the air. Meanwhile, the poem lists the figures of the plantation tradition only to bring attention to their absence. Like the prospect poems of Cooper and Goldsmith, the Deserted Plantation narrates the abandonment and subsequent ruin of the countryside, with the political subtext in this case being black emigration from the southern states during the Jim Crow nadir. Yet, in the concluding stanza, this movement is countered by the speaker's decision to remain on the scene. With its final vision of heaven as a big plantation in the sky, the poem retrogressively insists on maintaining the plantation tradition, even after the old home has been abandoned by all the plantation figures called to mind through its dialect form. As such, the poem narrates the end of the fantasy of vernacular culture by replacing oral songs with the printed poem. I intend these brief readings to demonstrate some of the ways that Dunbar's poems engage with the formal conventions that made them meaningful to readers, I would argue. Considering dialect as a genre rather than as a linguistic convention or essence allows us to contextualize his work in ways that clarify the strange cultural power that continues to animate the long afterlife of these poems. Thanks.
Good afternoon. I'm honored to be here today among such distinguished colleagues. That old-time religion, an Afro-Christian faith tradition in Dunbar's short stories. I think that to properly situate Paul Laurence Dunbar in the cultural, historical, and literary context in which he rightfully belongs, we must be willing to confront and to critique his ideas about religion and religious faith. These ideas about religious faith invade all of his writing, but in particular his short stories. His short stories have simply not received the critical attention that they deserve. At best, they are simply dismissed as being conventional, formulaic. Sometimes they are considered too much the remnants of the plantation tradition. At worst, they're just simply dismissed and not considered at all. I want to offer a third possible entree into reading Paul Laurence Dunbar's short stories, and that is through the lens of Christian biblical rhetoric. If we do this, we can perhaps look at his short fiction as a vehicle for both the confirmation as well as the contestation of this old-time religion. His reworking of well-known biblical stories and parables in his short stories reflects his generation's challenge of reconciling the faith of their fathers, what I'm going to call slave religion, with other emerging faith systems of the post-Reconstruction era, including what I'm calling a system of unbelief, and you see that particularly in his novel, The Uncalled. By reading his short stories through the lens of religious criticism, I think the reader is left to really grapple with both the negative and the positive aftermaths of slave religion for African Americans. At first glance, his short story, The Strength of Gideon, 1900, seems to fit all too neatly within the plantation tradition of American fiction. This plantation tradition we're familiar with, which was to invoke this kind of nostalgic imagery of slavery and slave life. And this is particularly true in the short stories, as they were often accompanied by caricatures and etchings of stereotypical Black life. And in effect, the plantation tradition of writing sought to re-enslave African Americans by presenting them only in a picture of racial inferiority. So the story of The Strength of Gideon fits almost perfectly within this. Set in Kentucky in the last days of the slave era, Gideon makes a vow to his master that he would take care of the women on the plantation no matter what happens to the master and to his son. His vow is tested as first the master dies and then the son dies. This vow that Gideon makes is tested when his beloved betrothed fiancée, Martha, a biblical name, whom he has refused to marry while the master is away fighting in the war, urges him to seek the freedom as the Union troops invade their particular city. Gideon is left to deal with what happens after both his masters die and his betrothed decides to leave him, and he's abandoned essentially at the plantation. The story ends with the young lover's parting words. It says, and this is Dunbar, "He drew out a pace after the troops, and then turning, he looked back at the house. He went a step farther, and then a woman's gentle voice called him, 'Gideon.' He stopped, he crushed his cap in his hands, and the tears came into his eyes. Then he answered, 'Yes, Miss Ellen, I's a-comin'.' He stood, he watched the dusty column until the last blue leg swung out of sight and over the gray hills. The last drum tap died away, and then turned and retraced his steps toward the house. Gideon had triumphed mightily." One critic, and there's very little criticism about his short stories, so I'll just use this critic throughout, writes that The Strength of Gideon triggers, quote, "all the ideological assumptions of the plantation formula. Mutual affection between the races, paternalistic white benevolence and Black gratitude, dependency, and loyalty." He says, quote, "because reconciliation, not liberation, is the governing motive of this short story, Gideon falls short of full humanity." End quote. For this critic, it seems that Gideon's final choice to abandon both his love interest as well as his opportunity for freedom is evidence of psychological enslavement. And I think we could certainly agree that that is one reading. The critic goes on to say that his humanity as well as his manhood can only be achieved if he privileges his own personal bodily freedom over his verbal commitment to his slave master. But my argument is that a more complete reading of this story depends on understanding how this fiction engages a meta-narrative, that is, the biblical story of Gideon. Dunbar would have been well aware that his readership at the turn of the century would have thought of The Strength of Gideon in light of the biblical story. What does The Strength of Gideon reveal to us when it is read as a deliberate dialogue between the protagonist that Dunbar creates and the biblical character? First, Dunbar is clear to draw attention to the name that he chooses, Gideon, and the biblical character. He's named Gideon because his mother comes through religion when she's pregnant with Gideon, and that was the sermon that was being preached. This name marks Gideon on the plantation. Dunbar writes, "The appointed man is always marked, and so Gideon was by receiving his full name. No one ever shortened his scriptural name. He was always Gideon from the time he bore the name out of the heat of camp meeting fervor until his master discovered his worthiness." The circumstances of Gideon's birth, the mother to whom Gideon is born, and the communal expectations of this quote-unquote marked child neatly contrast with the biblical Gideon, who is also set apart for a holy mission. If you know your Bible well, and in case you don't, I'm going to give you a little scripture lesson today. The biblical Gideon, the angel of the Lord, appears to him and says, "God is with you, you mighty man of valor." He instructs Gideon that he is to save Israel from the hand of their enemies. Gideon replies, quote, "How can I save Israel? Indeed, my clan is the weakest, and I am the least in my father's house." See, this biblical account depends on the construction of Gideon as weak and the least in his father's house. So the angel has to affirm that he is indeed a mighty man of valor. Well, of course, Dunbar here is signifying on the term the least of these. This biblical phrase often used to invoke the most humble, the most contrite, the most lowly, but it speaks to the reappropriation of that term in the African-American vernacular. Biblically, a people rendered the least of these because of their condition and bondage are also most likely to be the inheritors of the kingdom of God. So the biblical story rests on the idea that the least likely person to be considered a warrior, in this case a young boy from a very small clan, he is the true source of strength. Likewise, Dunbar's story of Gideon, who we may easily dismiss because he fits too neatly into this mold of plantation fiction because he is too much of a quote-unquote Uncle Tom, is also the unlikely hero of this contemporary parable. God calls Gideon. Gideon raises an army of 32,000 Israelites. God whittles that army down to 300, and those 300 men go into battle. The night of the battle, Gideon and his soldier do three things. They light torches, they blow their trumpets, and they shout a command. The command is for the Lord and for Gideon. The enemies, who number about 150,000, are so confused by the noise and by the trumpets that they panic and they fight each other, and they are defeated. Gideon is urged to accept the mantle of the kingship of Israel after this, but he refuses, and he says, quote, "I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. Only the Lord shall rule over you." And instead, he remains a judge. Now, Dunbar's Gideon, besides, of course, the name that I think Dunbar is very clear about signifying, also models his protagonist after this biblical story. The stories both depend, both the biblical story and Dunbar's story, on speech acts. So Gideon's soldiers have to say for the Lord and for Gideon. Well, Gideon in the short story is a singer and he is also a minister. And he is marked as a young child with a loud voice. As a parent, you understand when a young child has a loud voice, you have to say to yourself, that means they're going to be someone special. So there's the efficacy. There's the efficacy of language and how language functions in both of these stories. There are speech acts in both of these stories. There are societal and communal expectation in both of these stories. But I think importantly, how these stories end is essential to our reading. Gideon in the biblical story decides he will not be a king and only a judge. Gideon in Dunbar's story decides that he will not seek out his bodily freedom and that he will remain true to the vow that he made to his slave master. The critic that I mentioned said that you have to read the ending ironically, where it says that Gideon triumphed, quote unquote, mightily. This last line is ironic if only you believe that the battle that Gideon is waging is between enslavement and freedom. I suggest the battle is bigger than that. The 1896 decision of Plessy versus Ferguson had proven that racial segregation and institutional racism had no geographical boundary that could be respected. So the battle lines are not clearly the North and the South. Gideon does triumph mightily if he can achieve a spiritual and bodily freedom wherever he is, despite the continuing presence of the peculiar institution of racism and slavery. He triumphs mightily when we see that despite societal expectations, he remains true to his vow. However, we as readers agree or disagree with that, we know that we have to accord Gideon his full humanity by his decision and his choice. I want to offer just 3 brief conclusions that I think we can use to apply this short story to the larger body of Dunbar's work and how he is in fact dealing with turn of this century religious life for Black people. 1, there is the central conflict between looking forward and looking back that we see in so much of Dunbar's work. Gideon, the Old Testament biblical figure, is contrasted with his girlfriend Martha, who has a New Testament name. So we have this idea of who will go forward and who will look back. In the post-Reconstruction era, rural Black churches and institutions of religious life in general were undergoing profound shifts. Obviously, there was a lot of migration. There was a great deal of institutionalization, emphasis on better educated clergy, larger church buildings, more liturgical forms of worship. And many Black churchgoers were abandoning the traditional rural ways of life. So then can we imagine that this story, The Strength of Gideon, is about who will stay and who will go, because those who remain are part of the preservation of Black folk life. Secondly, I want to offer the idea that if we read The Strength of Gideon and we think about the protagonist as a warrior, in true biblical fashion as Gideon is the warrior, then we talk about the post-Reconstruction era and its options for Black religious life. There were other things going on besides mainstream Christianity, including the rise in formal Ethiopianism, independent Black churches not affiliated with certain denominations, the Black Jewish movement, and so on. But there was also this idea of unbelief. Will we continue to believe in this God? Will we continue to believe in this faith system? So I want to offer the possibility of reading The Strength of Gideon as an impetus for its readership to say, we can still believe in the God who has sustained us and who has nurtured us and who has helped to lead us out of, quote unquote, our wilderness of slavery. And finally, because I know my time is up, I want to offer a third possibility of reading The Strength of Gideon as well as Dunbar's engagement with religious texts, which is that the faith of our fathers can be a literary device. More than just a tool of criticism, I think it is a celebration in this short story of the common faith-infused vernacular that African Americans use in both their speech and in their writing. The biblical language that Dunbar uses in his fiction as well as in his poetry is our linguistic heritage, just as much as the dialect. The first portion of my paper's title is extracted from, of course, the spiritual, Just Give Me That Old-Time Religion. In true call and response fashion, I know many of you would know the next line would be, it's good enough for me. So even though the spiritual predated Dunbar by several generations, and even though we have some conflict as to whether or not we want to consider Dunbar himself as a spiritual man, what I do want to offer in this very brief reading is the idea that the biblical vernacular that Dunbar gives us is a site of resistance, is a site of contestation, it is the site of preservation of folk culture and folk material. Dunbar himself may not have been a particularly religious man, but the fact that his short fiction is biblically haunted speaks to the efficacy of a Christian tradition in providing African Americans with a distinct linguistic framework in which we still can use to tell our stories. And let the church say, amen.
Hello. Hello. Last night I was reading Houston Baker's extraordinary description of the Centennial Conference at UC Irvine celebrating Paul Laurence Dunbar's birth, which appeared in Black World in February 1973. A mixture came to mind of several things. First, that we didn't have to wait 100 years, as Baker had anticipated, for the next major gathering to honor our great American poet. That the 33 years that have elapsed since that conference were in fact so brief and yet encompassed the entire life and work of Dunbar, how the world has changed and how it hasn't, and how welcome the 15-minute time slots are as a way of offering a tasting flight of suggested ideas for further exploration compared to Roscoe Lee Brown, described by Houston Baker, in his $500 give or take a few suit and his high-heeled shoes, who performed Dunbar's works at the Irvine Conference for 3 hours, prompting the comment, Roscoe Lee must have gotten a fortune from UC, and bless his heart, he wanted to earn his money. I was also thinking about Baker's essay in relation to my topic, home in the spirituals and Dunbar's poetry, and what's taken place in the last 30 years and the last 130 years. The respect shown by Stanford University and our hosts, in addition to the extraordinary colleagues that I've mainly come here to listen to, has made me hopeful that we're coming closer to making the home that's deserved for both Dunbar and the spirituals in the canon of indispensable American verse. In the African American spirituals, home rarely has a single and determinate meaning. It is a concept characterized by multiplicity, with a range of meanings that can be literal, but is more often metaphorical, theological, historical, futuristic, even hypothetical, existing purely in the realm of imagination. Associations of home radiate backwards and forwards in time, to a past in Africa that such references aim in a state of metaphysical impossibility to recapture, and to heaven as the final resting place projected ahead to the future. Home in the spirituals is depicted in relation to an emotional respite with friends and family, having a place in one's ancestral or current community, release from bondage, and freedom of spirit even if the body is in chains. Few literary symbols in any culture or era have operated with such resonant sophistication on such a prismatic wealth of conceptual planes, all proposed with equivalent authorial commitment as the spirituals in their imagery of home. In the spirituals' references to home, it is typically not possible to differentiate the literal from the metaphorical plane. For this reason, in discussing the spirituals elsewhere, I've called on Mark Turner and Gilles Fauconnier's concept of blended spaces, or creative blends, to explain that one of their unique sources of power is a technique of enacting multiple cognitive operations simultaneously. Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't you moan, Pharaoh's army got drowned. Here, for example, is a cognitive blend which activates 3 worlds and time frames. The slaves in the 19th century, Mary in the time of the New Testament, and Pharaoh in the time of the Old Testament, and seamlessly maps their correspondence in 2 condensed lines. Blended spaces most often emerge in historical or cultural circumstances when a new idea is essential to express a shifting perspective that cannot be conveyed using conventional linguistic mechanisms. The cognitive blend emerges when 2 ostensibly divergent metaphorical realms are mapped over each other, and their intersection results in a resonant, fresh idea which is not found in either of the input spaces, as we see in the example from O Mary. In the spirituals, the blended space typically has its inputs in the complex intersection of early African American Christianity, survivals of African philosophy, and the historical circumstances of plantation life. The spirituals themselves, with their own complicated array of inputs, become one of the source domains for Paul Laurence Dunbar. The influence includes his appropriation, reconstruction, and adaptation of this imagery of home, where home itself remains a concept charged with ambiguity, desire, self-determination, loss, absence, and myth-making. We see how the Kecoughtan Camera Club's photographic illustrations of Dunbar's poetry work in fascinating conjunction with this imagery of home, sometimes illuminating a stunning paternalism, and at other times exhibiting a disturbing romanticization of the fragments of plantation culture. But in relation to my topic, I'd like to especially point out the way the Camera Club's photographs narrow our angle of perspective to a space that I believe is very real and present in Dunbar's poetry in its imaginary of home, and that is the doorway. I'd also like to add as a sidebar that it's often observed that Dunbar's poetry must stand alone from its illustrations, and so it must, and yet we know from the Camera Club's meticulously maintained minutes, which are archived at Hampton University, that Dunbar did have something like veto power over the photos presented to him for inclusion in the 6 books which the Camera Club illustrated. The dialogue between the Camera Club illustrations and Dunbar's view of the past and future as represented by home both extend and challenge the spiritual's view of home. Similarly to the spirituals, Dunbar's poems and the accompanying illustrations abstract and fragment the concept of home to address various 19th century myths of cabin life in relation to the construction of a new and modern sense of African American place, history, community, and identity. It can hardly be missed that many of the photographs accompanying Dunbar's poems show figures, most frequently male, in the doorway of a home, neither in the fields nor solidly ensconced on the inside in a place of safety and self-determination. This liminal state applies to time as much as politics and the psychological ramifications of Reconstruction. In Long Ago, for instance, which appeared in Jogging Along in 1906, we see 3 separate images of male figures in the doorway of a cabin. These images accompany the first 3 stanzas of the poem. Stanzas 1 and 2 focus on the loss of the old times and the hymns of the past, the slave songs, which are explicitly connected to community through nostalgia for the meetin, and their image is a figure who is literally poised in the space in between. But the third illustration accompanies stanza 3, the transitional moment where the reader realizes that the nostalgia for the cultural and chronological past was actually the metaphor and not the literal meaning. The persona's advancing age appears to be the actual subject, not the political juxtaposition of a past contrasted with present. And yet this too is represented by a figure in a doorway, extending the imagery of home and the spirituals into Dunbar's world on the verge of the 20th century. Similarly to the representations of home and the spirituals, we see that home is often evanescent or a constellation of fragmentary references in Dunbar, gesturing toward multiple sites at once that are not all on the same conceptual plane. We see similar images in numerous Camera Club illustrations where figures are either hovering on the external perimeter of a cabin or perched in the doorway. I'd like to suggest that such literary and visual imagery is a virtual icon of deliberate and controlled ambivalence, ambiguity, and cognitive dissonance. We see this frame of mind reflected in the poetry's stylized and strategized mourning for the spirituals themselves, which rapidly became seen in Reconstruction by the newly freed people as part of the history of slavery. Dunbar's representations of home, which clearly allude to the spirituals, remind us that the spirituals themselves and the plantation life which they depicted already were characterized by ambiguities associated with a state of deprivation of a stable and unitary sense of home, of homeland, and of being at home in the world. Long Ago explicitly addresses romantic nostalgia attached to advancing age absent of racial signifiers, but the setup is generated through the evocation of the persona's youth on the plantation, as visually represented by the dual image of a man perched half in and half out. We see a male figure standing on the steps of a home in a candlelight in time, a woman leaning against the door of a house in the deserted plantation, and a man sitting immediately outside of a home's door in the same poem. In a banjo song, a large group of individuals sits and leans against the perimeter of a house, including 2 men leaning against the front door, 1 leaning against the front window. In another photograph illustrating the same poem, a whole family is grouped outside the home, and in still another, a woman sits alone next to and outside the door. The non-locatability of home in the spirituals is strongly consonant with the ambivalence that later appears in Dunbar. On the verge of the 20th century, it was unclear in this new world what the role would be of African Americans, but the roots of this uncertainty already had appeared in the slave songs in their representation of a home that was almost, by definition, elsewhere.
Well, thank you all very much. We've got plenty of time for questions. I just wanted to make 1 or 2 comments. I think that all of those papers really gave us a sense of Dunbar's breadth of poetic achievement and his formal self-consciousness, the way that as a poet he was working with and striving against various accepted literary and cultural conventions, various different genres. We heard about the elegy and the way that Dunbar self-consciously mutates the elegiac form as he theorizes a racial past, and the problems of claiming an integral collective past body with the trauma of slavery. We heard about Dunbar's play with the ballad form as well as a representation of folk people, the way that Dunbar exploits and works against and uses dialect as a liminal space between the oral and the literate. We heard about Dunbar's play with biblical meta-narratives and the genre, the biblical genre, as a way of intervening in a post-Reconstruction culture of unbelief. And finally, we heard about Dunbar's play with the genre of the spiritual, and in particular the patterns of domesticity, representations of homes, and in particular the doorway, and the way that that becomes a space in which Dunbar creates a very ambivalent sense of a post-slavery African-American identity. So I thought there was a real continuity and integrity and a thread that ran through all of those papers very beautifully. So thank you all very much. And I'm happy to field questions from the audience.
Hi, I'm Lauri Brooks from the University of Michigan. I wanted to know if the panelists could comment on Dunbar's communication of a certain kind of African-American interiority. It seems like there, for me, for my work with Dunbar, it seems like there's a special concern about the body, the black body, and how African-Americans are sort of acted upon and also act. But also there, it seems like that those references to the body are also references to a certain kind of consciousness, often in development. And it seems like your papers kind of alluded to that, and I wonder if whoever might be interested in this question could illuminate more of that for me.
Well, there's a very interesting grammar in terms of Dunbar's poetic representations, and so that the way to move inward is to go outward. And so, yes, one does see this sort of persistent gaze upon external physicality. But that's a move that is meant to yield sort of insight of the self within. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do with the elegy and thinking about Dunbar's use of the elegy as a form is sort of kind of decoding these sort of languages whereby he's actually largely getting at relations between black men and how to establish rites of passage with respect to leadership, lines of continuity and community. But his strategy is to do that indirectly. And in that respect, I don't think Dunbar is atypical for African-American male writers.
I'm Sandra Govan from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. I'd like to say that I thought all the panelists were wonderful, but I thought Yolanda Pierce's was just dynamite. And let the congregation say amen again. And I was wondering if there were other stories that you could read in that same way through the use of the biblical framework.
Thank you. Yes. He authored close to 100, I believe, short stories. And you know, because of the time, I just wanted to concentrate on one. But there are a number of them. And one of the things that I wish I had time to talk about was that a number of them are about biblical women, right? A number of them are about the Hannahs and the Deborahs of the Bible. And I think there's a real way where we can read Dunbar's play with both gender and biblical and gender roles and the biblical imagery. But for me, it's just a way, an insight into his short stories, which simply don't get the recognition that they deserve and sort of get dismissed because it seems like they're just so formulaic. He just kind of changes it around a little bit, but it's stereotypical. The etchings that accompanied the short stories were caricatures. There's a wonderful short story called The Fruitful Sleeping of Reverend Elisha, and it's accompanied by a caricature of, you know, very dark, you know, small kind of man. but the story itself is about redemption and regeneration, and this minister imagined as a Lazarus. And we know that this kind of biblical imagery sustains all of African American literature. And I think that if we want to look at a point of insight into how Dunbar's short stories are as artistically crafted as his poetry, I think that the biblical narrative is one way to do that.
I'd like to second about the great papers, but also for Yolanda, I was wondering if you thought about the ending to Gideon as being like the marrow of tradition, where he is in a way more the male honor and he's truer to his word, as a kind of ironic commentary on male honor, or how masculinity, how you deal with that.
Yes, I think that that's exactly right. There were a couple of things going on there. One was because of the lack of criticism, the only critic that I could find who addressed the short story said, well, this is evidence of still his psychological enslavement. And that just bothered me so much that I just wanted a way to read it as really this is evidence of his full humanity. The way to give enslaved people their humanity is to give them the option to make choices that whether we agree or disagree with. Whether we agree with his decision to stay on the plantation or whether we disagree with that, his choice and his desire to keep his vow, which for him is coded in his religious belief, I think gives him his full humanity. But then the argument would be about his manhood as well, right? And so the vow that he makes to his slave master is to protect the women on the plantation. So it is a way of the patriarchal protection, and when the white men on the plantation die, then it's left to the black men on the plantation to protect still the white women, because his fiancée goes off on her own. So who's going to protect her, presumably? So I think there is a real commentary there about manhood, about humanity, about still in some ways replicating biblical paternalistic roles as well. And so I offer that just to say that the ending can be very complicated, and I'm okay with the ending, you know, doing a multiple variety of things, but certainly I'm invested in the ending also speaking to how important it was for him to keep a vow that he made, not simply to this family as his slave masters, but a vow he felt he made to God. And honoring that vow before God, I read as what the biblical Gideon does, which is, I'm not going to be king because God didn't tell me to be king. He told me to just be a judge. So it's about honoring that first and foremost, other than sort of a patriarchal rereading of psychological enslavement.
Amrit Singh, I wonder if I could, you know, as Professor Jones said, there is a kind of connectedness to all these papers. A lot of you were dealing with issues of continuity, of intertextuality, of tradition, looking back, looking forward, you know, with the elegy, with the language of faith also becoming a literary device, a weapon, with the whole idea of the dialect as a genre, going back and forth. And I think it also connects with the question that Kenneth Warren raised in the previous session, because you know, I've been thinking a lot about it recently. I think there is a much more fluidity here in terms of tradition and intertextuality than the literary history acknowledges. And major figures, including Dunbar, but the pattern becomes clearer with Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison and Toni Morrison and James Baldwin the Tax and Richard Wright and so on. They have had this habit of constructing their representativeness in overworked ways. So I was wondering, in relation to the particular kind of themes that you chose to focus on, whether you have some thoughts on those.
One of the things that's so wonderful about Dunbar is that he's this sort of multivalent figure. There are so many Dunbars, as many, for example, as there are lyrical personae whom he sort of constructs. And there's actually a tendency for us to overemphasize the woe is me, you know, this is what my audience wanted, this isn't what I wanted to write. When one needs to understand that his personal psychology is far more complex than that, the dynamics of authorship and consumption are far more complex than that. But that he was just this brilliant, talented man who demonstrated such brilliance and such a range of genres over a period of time through which he, as he was maturing, was sort of changing in his outlook on various kinds of issues. And so if he isn't the representative figure, he is such an authoritative figure. And if we understand him better, we're likely to understand other figures better.
I think I just wanted to add on to that. I mean, I guess one of the frustrations that I have just overall with commentary on Dunbar is this tendency to treat him as though dialect, so-called dialect poems and so-called standard language poems are two totally separate categories, and that our tendency to value the dialect over the non-dialect actually puts us quite close to readers from the 1890s, I guess, in ways that are kind of uncomfortable, I think. So I mean, one of my interests is just to explore those poems, either where those two categories directly overlap, or where, I mean, they're quite clearly in commentary with each other.
Yeah, I'm Wilfred Samuels from the University of Utah. Yes, there are black people in Salt Lake City, Utah. I too would like to add my. Well, I don't know, since I'm here, I don't know if there's any left, but it's okay. I'll be back on Sunday. I too would like to add my voice to the panel, and thank you for opening these many windows to this individual that, as you've described him, is multivalent. I wanted to address my question to Dr. Pierce because I found your response to the last question kind of interesting, and I'd like to ask if you've extended, and I don't have an opinion one way or the other, your thought to what he does with the family in the longer works. For example, Sports of the God, the family who returns to the South after spending time in Harlem, and not just return to the South, but they return to the space, to the location, the cabin behind the master's house. And I wonder if you added that ending to your story, if you would change your answer. Do you guys know the story? All right, thank you.
No, I don't think I'd change my answer. And just a little snippet that I offered at the very end, which was, if you look at something, I suggested Plessy versus Ferguson, but you could look at a whole lot of different things. It didn't take black people very long to figure out that racism and Jim Crow was going to follow them wherever they went, and that the North was not the promised land that they thought that it would be. It didn't take us 50 years to figure that out. It may have taken critics a very long to figure that out, but I think the first person who went said, oh my. Because of that, I think in my own work I'm invested in those who choose to remain and what those spaces represent for them, and about the retention of the materials, but as also the very space itself. If we just take a moment and think about Gideon in a different way, he remains at home. Now, we don't want to use, and I was thinking about this as my colleague here was talking about home, we often don't want to use the very place that was the site of our enslavement as home. But if that's not home, I don't know where else it can be. And for Gideon, in addition to the vow, this place as a site of home, this place as a site of family, I think for him speaks to some of what Dunbar does with his extended work. So no, I'm not sure that I would change my answer. All I want to do is trouble the water. That's what I want to do, and say we've got to complicate more simplistic readings. If we do that with the dialect, and we have to do that with the North versus South divide, I think we have to really complicate our readings as we know simply how racism functioned in this period of time, there are no easy answers here. And so what I am also invested in is the recovery of different ways to think about full humanity for enslaved people. And that, to me, doesn't get talked about enough. The people who go and the people who escape and the fugitives are men. But the people who remain behind, the women with the babies, what are they? Are they not fully human? So I'm just trying to trouble the waters to get us to think about the very, intentional here, black and white spaces as more complicated and reading the biblical through that. So, and I think that extends to his longer works as well and his poetry.
And mine is actually rather quick, and it kind of builds off of that's for Yolanda Pierce also. And I guess my interest is in the concluding story that goes with the finding of Martha. How does this story sort of complicate the elements you're looking at in that? I mean, I guess because you said, do people stay or do they go? Here we have the two of them, Gideon and Martha, get back together. Right. And so I guess, does this shift the field for you, or is it just more of the same, or how would you sort of take that?
Well, Martha leaves. Martha goes with the Union troops, and she becomes an aide to the nurse of the Union troop. And here's another moment where I read it biblically. If you know who Martha is in the New Testament, she and Mary are the first to discover the body, or the fact that the tomb was empty. And as the resurrected Jesus appears to them, they are told to go and tell the story. So effectively, Martha becomes one of the first ministers, right? We don't give her the credit she's due. We tend to think about the apostles, but there were women. So when I look at the ending, and I think, I have an explanation for Gideon remaining, but I also think that it's artistic on Dunbar's part that Martha is the one who goes, because she goes to tell the good news. She actually becomes the one who has mobility, whereas often women did not have the kind of mobility that Martha had. They have that wonderful parting scene where Gideon has to turn and he walks back toward the plantation house, and he sees Martha go over the hills. But I read that too in the same sort of vein of using this as biblical vernacular. Martha goes and she tells the good news, and Gideon remains. And it's often like a reversal of how we assume that women's roles function in slavery and post-slavery era as well.
I'm reluctant really to ask questions at conferences. I just had a couple though, and one is in response to Professor Pierce's wonderful lecture, which I think it's fantastically complicates the story, but and I don't mean to be flippant to anything, but I just wonder whether it does not rely a little bit too heavily on faith. I mean, it does seem to be that it could possibly be an instance of faith-based literary criticism, because in some respects, Gideon is not much of an advance on Uncle Tom. I am not a critic of Uncle Tom, and I don't mean to criticize Uncle Tom, but it doesn't seem to me that that you can read him in a particularly heroical light, politically. And I think that if you are going to complicate the ending, then one has to take into account such things, for example, as if it's a chivalric gesture, a question of honor, the extent to which honor is at the core, or was at the core of so much of Southern racism, the Klan and so on. My other question, if I had one, would be directed to Marcellus, and that is to ask about the role of religion in the elegy. I don't know if you touched on that at all. I was, I think, 1 minute or 2 minutes late in coming. Because in so many elegies, so many great elegies, religion is an essential part. And the great elegy, to me, at the turn of the century, while Dunbar is writing, well, there are two, and they're both in the Souls of Black Folk. One is of the passing of the firstborn, and the other one is of Alexander Crummell. And in both instances, Du Bois, who is absolutely a non-believer, nevertheless moves towards religion instinctively in order to find, the proper parameters, as it were, for a discussion of the passing of someone. And, well, you see why I should not have asked the question.
Okay, well, yeah. My response to my former professor will be very quick. I will simply just offer that the audience that Dunbar had in his time is very different than we as readers today. So I would just say that I don't think I rely too heavily on faith, only because I just want to suggest that his readership really would have gone there first. That in incorporating this kind of language and using these particular character names and really retelling some of these stories without much imagination, taken almost straight from the Bible, I think his readers would have gone there first for their interpretation. I think we are a different kind of readership, and so I applaud my colleagues who are doing all of the other kinds of literary criticism that needs to be done with Dunbar. I just offer this as a possibility, as an entry into the story that we don't do anymore, that I think his first generation of readers may have done. That's what, just in a word from
just a quick response to my dear friend. It's actually interesting that in the elegies and elsewhere, it seems to me, in so much of Dunbar's poetry, Dunbar seems to be interested in religious discourse, but only really to the extent that it serves specific political ends. And there's a way in which, in the elegies, some of the later elegies, he actually are heartfelt. There's pain, there's rupture, there's mourning, but a kind of incomplete movement toward consolation. He doesn't really turn to the Bible or religious belief in those moments. But he does turn to the Bible for the logic of the way we read the poetry, so that if we talk about Ethiopia, we're pointing to this African past. And so he's sort of using religion as a discourse that's very important if he wants to sort of speak to, as I use the term, his kind of beloved community. But he's writing from the position of kind of relative unbelief.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.